Stanford University.
Introduce our first speaker, who is Omer Bartov, an expert on the German Army's atrocities in the western part of the Soviet Union during World War II. He teaches at Brown University, where he's a professor of European history and currently chair of the department. And his many books include Mirrors of Destruction, Germany's War and the Holocaust, The Jew in Cinema, and Erased, Vanishing Traces of Jewish Galicia in present-day Ukraine. And he's now completing a book, which I believe we're going to hear about today, and we'll await breathlessly, called The Voice of Your Brother's Blood, Batoch, Biography of a Town.
Thank you, and thank you all for this really interesting conference. Thanks to the organizers and all the participants. What I will try to do today is the following. The context of this talk is the question of how do history and memory interact within history itself, and how do different historical narratives make history happen, make for historical eradication, and may also make for eventual reconciliation. My specific talk will be about the book that was just mentioned, that I'm trying to complete in the next few months. And if I have time in the last 5 minutes, I'll try to relate to some of the questions, interesting questions, that were provided by the organizers of the conference, and to see how they relate to issues that concern also this talk. During this talk, you will see a lot of images, and I'm not going to talk about them directly, but I'm sure that you can both listen to me and watch images at the same time. The title of the book that I'm talking about, that was just mentioned, obviously relates to the following passage from Genesis. And God said to Cain, "Where is Abel, your brother?" And he said, "I don't know. Am I my brother's keeper?" And he said, "What have you done? The voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground." That's Genesis 4, verses 9 and 10. In spring 1944, the region around the town of Batoch erupted into a wave of horrific violence. The Wehrmacht, forced to retreat from parts of eastern Galicia in March, counterattacked the following month and drove back the Red Army. Batoch was once more under German rule. For the next 3 months, this remote region of eastern Poland, now part of western Ukraine, underwent a chaotic upheaval. The German security police regional outpost, assisted by local Ukrainian auxiliary units, continued to hunt down and murder Jews until it was finally dismantled. As the Gestapo vacated the scene, some local German officials, along with commanders of retreating combat units, protected the remnants of the Jewish population from local militias, roaming bandits, and murderous villagers. Simultaneously, Ukrainian nationalist forces carried out a vast ethnic cleansing operation against the Polish communities of the province. Here, too, the retreating Germans helped the Poles flee to the relative safety of Poland's heartland. And when the Soviets finally returned, they launched a massive liquidation operation against Ukrainian nationalists. What the Jews perceived as liberation, many Ukrainians saw as reoccupation. The soil of eastern Galicia was soaked in blood. But who spilled the blood and for what reason remains open to interpretation, obfuscation, and distortion. The events of these months are sparsely documented, but we do possess numerous eyewitness reports in diaries, post-war testimonies, and judicial records. In fact, these personal perspectives offer a rich source of information on the entire war, complementing official records and enabling us to sketch a detailed picture of genocide on the local level. Historians have underused these accounts, viewing them as too subjective and too painful. This has greatly impoverished our understanding of crucial aspects of World War II and the Holocaust. In June 1943, the Germans declared Buchach and its surrounding Judenrein, clean of Jews. All Jews not employed on the few remaining agricultural farms and labor camps could be shot on sight. Many hid in peasants' homes, barns, and sheds. They had to pay a lot of money to the peasants who were hiding them, testified the teenager Elias Chalfen in November 1947. The peasants would spend the money in town only to be followed back by the Ukrainian police, who went straight to the houses that had been pointed out to them as hiding Jews and would immediately execute them in the yard of the house. Soon, denouncing Jews reached unprecedented levels. The peasants themselves began murdering and chasing them out. That's a quote from Chalfen. Esther Greenthal recorded in 1997 that when the Ukrainian militia passed through the farm where she worked, she would, quote, hide in the toilet and count the shots, knowing by that how many people were killed. Later, Cossacks and others who had collaborated with the Germans began murdering the Jews. Since they did not have enough guns, they hanged people or killed them with axes. Along with some collaborators from the village, she testified, they locked us up in an empty barn. They began beating us. They shot a line of people with one bullet, but the bullet didn't reach me. Again, I was put in a line, and again, the bullet didn't reach me. So they began killing people with knives. I was stabbed 3 times. Greenthal was saved by a German army doctor who reportedly said to her, "What did the Ukrainian swine do to you?" Pity and empathy were rare, though not entirely extinct sentiments during those dark times. School teacher Aryeh Klonitsky wrote in his diary in 1943, "The hatred of the immediate surroundings knows no boundaries. Millions of Jews have been slaughtered, and it is yet not satiated." He and his wife were denounced and murdered shortly thereafter. Joachim Minzer's diary refers to executions mainly by Ukrainian policemen. He too was killed in 1943. The teenager Yoel Katz recalled the peasants surrounding his camp and shouting, "All the children out, we're going to kill you." They used axes for the massacre. Katz stresses, "The Germans who came from the front protected us from the Ukrainians until the Russians arrived." Edja Spielberg Flietman was hidden with her family by, quote, a poor farmer with a wife and 4 children. Later she was denounced by a Ukrainian workmate and finally was rescued by a local German commander. She estimates that, quote, 80% of my family were killed by the Ukrainians who were our friends. By then, the vast majority of the Jews in Galicia had been murdered. But without these personal perspectives, we would know close to nothing about this period. Moishe Spiegel testified shortly after the war that in January 1944, Ukrainian militiamen murdered most of the surviving 120 Jews on the farm where he worked, including his 14-year-old son. It is important to state, he emphasized, that this killing was carried out by Ukrainian policemen and bandits. He recalled the child orphans stacked up in a pile, victims lying with open guts. The local German administrator who tried to protect his workers, and when he left, quote, the Jews earnestly cried. But his replacement, a young German army officer, reportedly said to them, "As long as I am here, nothing will happen to you." Thanks to him, and we don't know his name, several hundred Jews survived in the town of Tvuste near Buchach until the Red Army arrived. Up to half of the victims of the Holocaust were murdered in or close to their own towns. The murderers often knew their victims and saw them face to face before shooting them. The killing was bloody, gruesome, and accompanied by much gratuitous cruelty. Along with Germans from various agencies, the killers and their collaborators included non-Jewish neighbors, acquaintances, colleagues, and classmates. the massacres were public, routine spectacles in which everyone played one role or another. Yulia Mikhailivna Trembach recorded in 2003 how, quote, the Jews dug their own graves and the Germans buried them alive. From the street where I lived, she said, I could see how the ground was moving over the people who were still not dead. Looking out of a classroom window, Maria Mikhailivna Khvostenko saw, quote, a crowd going around the municipal hall toward the bridge. Our schoolmates and friends, surrounded by gendarmes with dogs, Gestapo and militia, who were hurrying it toward the killing site. From the fall of 1942 to the end of 1943, she said, the Germans conducted roundups quite regularly. They would arrive on Thursday evening, work all night, and the next morning, as we hurried to school, we could see corpses of women, men, and children lying on the road. The Germans would throw infants from balconies onto the paved road. They were lying in the mud with smashed heads and spattered brains. We could hear machine gun fire from the killing site. This often intimate yet ghastly encounter between the killers, the killed, and the spectators can only be reconstructed in all its complexity on the local level. The town I chose is unknown to most people, but Buchach, which was Nobel Prize laureate Shmuel Yosef Agnon's hometown, was also where my mother spent her childhood. So here's the personal part. While I did not set out to write a family history, I was intrigued in writing this by the notion of writing a biography of a town that was also linked to my own biography. The tension between analytical detachment and empathetic understanding became the driving engine of the entire project. Based in Chortkov, a nearby town, some 20 to 30 members of the security police outpost, accompanied by mistresses and wives, children and parents, and assisted by approximately 350 Ukrainian auxiliary policemen, local town and village gendarmes, and Jewish policemen employed by the Jewish Council, murdered 60,000 Jews in the region. As in many other towns, the Holocaust in Buchach appeared as a series of extremely violent local roundups, degenerating at times into communal massacres. Of the 10,000 victims, half were transported to the Bezhetz extermination camp, and the rest were killed in situ. This corresponded to the fate of Eastern Galicia's 500,000 Jews as a whole, of whom 250,000 were gassed, while the rest were killed where they lived. Most of the killing occurred within 18 months in an area measuring less than half the size of the state of New York. Jews comprised half the population of Buchach, the other half being Poles and Ukrainians. Indeed, the German genocide of the Jews took place within a complex and increasingly volatile web of ethnic, religious, political, and national affiliations. In this context, the notion of bystanders became meaningless. When the occupier joins forces with local elements to murder a segment of the population, there are only degrees of engagement ranging from collaboration to resistance. Most protagonists fall within a gray zone. Some who hide the persecuted also denounce them. Some of the killers also rescued. Some collaborators turn to resistance. The rest tend to profit from their neighbor's misfortune. As the Ukrainian gymnasium teacher Viktor Petrikievich wrote in his unpublished diary in January 1944, some people who before the war were earning very little make fortunes. Only when the Red Army was about to return, he writes, merchants, craftsmen, and so forth, who were living in houses that had formerly belonged to the Jews, began moving out. They anticipate Jewish revenge. Even before World War I, Galicia had been a site of contestation between Poles and Ukrainians, dating back to the 1600s. 4 centuries of Jewish settlement in the area also left a legacy of resentment and occasional violence. The conduct of local protagonists during World War II was therefore in part influenced by collective memories, perceptions, and forms of behavior. Still, that final eruption of external and fraternal violence seemed to many both shocking and inevitable. To be sure, there had been much talk about the necessary unmixing of incompatible peoples, yet no one anticipated the scale and horror of what came to pass. Hence the unanswered question, why did such unprecedented and gruesome violence seem at the same time such a natural outcome of past events? Created following the Austrian annexation of southeast Poland in 1772, Galicia had not experienced major outbreaks of violence until World War I. But when the Germans invaded it in July 1941, they needed to do very little, at times nothing at all, to incite violence. In order to understand the nature of the precarious inter-ethnic balance between Poles, Ukrainians, and Jews in Galicia, we need to realize the widely diverging narratives of the past told by each group throughout their centuries of existence. These stories were not necessarily antagonistic, yet they presumed an essential cultural, spiritual, and material difference, and ended up creating a sense of unbridgeable divide between the groups. The Habsburg Empire managed inter-ethnic relations in Galicia quite effectively. Nationalists advocated education, economic progress, and political engagement, but largely refrained from violent confrontation. All this changed dramatically in World War I and the national ideological struggles that followed it. The devastation was on a scale not seen since the 17th century. Tens of thousands of soldiers were killed in close proximity to Batoch, which was occupied twice by the Russians and remained close to the front for much of the war. The unpublished diary of Antoni Sowinski, the headmaster of the boys' school in Batoch, reflects the intensification of anti-Semitic sentiments during the war. This is World War I. An account by Russian Jewish soldier Abalev, who arrived in Batoch in summer 1916, describes the gruesome pogrom just perpetrated by a Cossack formation which presented a terrifying, I'm quoting, a terrifying picture of destruction, vandalism, and cruelty. This is a unit that he belonged to. To be sure, as we learn from Ansky's chronicle of the Russian occupation, Ansky is, among other things, the author of the Dibuk, which you may know. His chronicle of the Russian occupation, Batoch was hardly an exception. The collapse of the Habsburg Empire was followed by an intense struggle between Ukrainians and Poles over the province. Although the Poles won the war and annexed Galicia, numerous Ukrainian atrocities against Polish civilians were widely reported. Simultaneously, a series of Polish pogroms against Jewish communities, prompted by allegations of Jewish lack of loyalty, led to the establishment of international commissions of inquiry. Clearly, the Jews did not fit into the Polish or Ukrainian visions of a new nation state. The legacy of this conflict and of the Russo-Polish War that followed it cast a long shadow over the interwar period. Ukrainian national aspirations had been dashed, resulting in continued violent resistance to Polish rule in Galicia, even as Jews encountered increasing official and popular anti-Semitism. The birthplace of such figures as historian Immanuel Ringenblum and so-called Nazi hunter Simon Wiesenthal, Batoch was described by the author Agnon, who visited it in 1930, as a community in decline. Many young Jews were leaving, while many others drifted toward socialism and Zionism. Young Ukrainians, for their part, were joining the increasingly radical organization of Ukrainian nationalists known as OUN, some of whose members became policemen under the German occupation, while others ended up being trained in Nazi Germany. The Soviet occupation of Galicia in 1939 brought 2 years of political terror and economic collapse. The new regime deported tens of thousands of Poles, Jews, and Ukrainians. When the Germans attacked in June 1941, the NKVD, the Soviet secret police, executed thousands of mostly Ukrainian political prisoners in local jails. These actions greatly exacerbated inter-ethnic animosity and played into the hands of the invading Nazis, who were quick to blame them on the Jews. The ensuing massacres of Jewish populations can thus be traced back most directly to Soviet policies and Nazi propaganda. As anti-Jewish violence became a daily routine under German occupation, Buchach was transformed into a community of genocide. Not all protagonists conformed to their assigned roles. While many young Ukrainian nationalists participated in Nazi mass murder, some older conservative leaders tried to stem the violence. As Poles found themselves targets of ethnic cleansing, they occasionally showed more willingness to help out their Jewish neighbors. While many peasants joined in the killing and looting, some isolated families hid Jews for little or no compensation. A few German officials and soldiers protected those they were ordered to kill. Conversely, the Jewish council and police in Buchach were notorious for their corruption and collaboration. Yet several policemen eventually joined the Jewish resistance. When the Soviets returned in 1944, they completed the transformation of Buchach into a homogeneous community. Large numbers of Ukrainian resistors and their families were deported to gulags or exiled to Kazakhstan, while a vast Polish-Ukrainian population exchange terminated Polish life in Galicia. Only a few residents of contemporary Buchach traced themselves back to its original inhabitants. They know little about their town's past. The communists have subsumed the genocide of the Jews under the general narrative of Soviet martyrdom and heroism. The new Western Ukrainian authorities have resurrected the nationalists of World War II as heroic figures, eliding their participation in ethnic cleansing and genocide. Thus, on the Fedor Hill, where thousands of Jews were murdered, a large memorial to Ukrainian freedom fighters has been erected. While a small memorial stone next to the unmarked mass grave is hidden in the woods and difficult to find, similarly, while a new statue of Ukrainian nationalist Stepan Bandera now adorns another hill overlooking the town, a memorial put up immediately after the liberation by survivors next to the unmarked mass graves in the Jewish cemetery was removed by the Soviet authorities. A new and an assuming memorial recently elected there is hidden from view and already crumbling. And last time I saw it, it was also used as an open-air toilet. The history of Buchach and its demise must be sought elsewhere, in dozens of archives in 9 countries and 9 languages, containing records ranging from contemporary official documentation and post-war police and court records to personal diaries, testimonies, interviews, and memoirs. These are voices from a world that was wiped out. One such voice is that of my mother, whom I interviewed in 1995, and that was actually the beginning of this project. For the first time, she spoke about her childhood, and the only time it turned out. Along with her parents and brothers, she immigrated to Palestine in 1935. No other member of my extended family emerged from the destruction. It is this oblivion that set me off on a quest for the lost voices of Buchach. That's the formal end of my talk. If I have 5 minutes, I'll try to say something, but if not,
Make it
3 minutes. Okay. So we were asked several questions. The first one was, how do we understand the historian's role and engagement in political and cultural conflicts about the past and the present? It's a really good question. So what I will mention to you within the context, the larger context of this project, are three interesting cases that are happening now. One is a PhD dissertation that was just completed, I think, at the University of Western Australia by a young Polish man, Krzysztof Lada, which is an analysis of the origins of Ukrainian national thinking and how that then was enacted during the massacres in Volhynia. Volhynia is a province just north of Galicia. It had also a mixed population of Poles, Ukrainians, and Jews, and that was where the organization of Ukrainian nationalists started in 1943, the ethnic cleansing of the Poles. And this was a really bloody episode in that war. What he argues is that much of what Ukrainian nationalists enact is something that they write about as their own victimization by Poles going back to the Cossack rebellion, to the Khmelnytsky uprising of 1648 and intervening periods, so that that becomes a kind of model for action in Volhynia. The second case I would mention, which is interesting in the sense of memory, history, and how they are still operating today, is a book manuscript that has not been published yet by another Polish historian, Grzegorz Rosoliński-Libe, which is a biography, and in fact the first major biography of Stepan Bandera, of the leader of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists and then of the UPA, of the Ukrainian Insurgent Army. Now, he came to give a talk in Kiev a couple of months ago, and his talk was disrupted, is a polite way of putting it, by the Svoboda nationalists, and he had to find shelter in the German consulate, which is another little irony. And what is so interesting is not just that the extreme right-wing nationalists attacked him, but that none of the major Ukrainian historians came out in his defense. They at the most said, well, it's a problematic book and we need to think about it, but no one actually came out in his defense. The third, I would say, and maybe I'll close here, although I have a lot of other things to say, is that I was really curious, quite apart from my opinion, which is known about Timothy Snyder's book, Bloodlands. What interested me in this context was its reception in Eastern Europe and how that book managed, in a complex way, to please large audiences in Eastern Europe, including groups that otherwise really have very little to agree about among themselves. And that sort of way of talking about the violence in the past, which is really based on seeing the violence as coming from the outside and ignoring the fact that much of it, as I was trying to very quickly say, was generated from inside, is a way of reconciliation that is largely, to my mind, based on obfuscation. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
I think that the newer literature on the Holocaust has largely been emphasizing, as you were talking about just now, local dimensions, the dirty Holocaust, not the opposite of industrial killing. But there's also something else you talked about, which, of course, World War I and the post-World War I question of antecedents. And this is something I was hoping you could talk about a bit more, because it could also throw light on one of the elephants, how many elephants you can have in a room. One of the elephants in the room, which of course the origins of the Nakba, which came up yesterday, that there is a difference between a kind of polemical argument that I've even seen in one of the most influential textbooks on the Arab-Israeli conflict, that by 1900 it was apparent to the Zionist movement that the aspirations of the Zionists could only be achieved by removing the Palestinians. I mean, it's just nonsense. There's a difference between that and obviously intelligent scholarship on the origins of ideas of transfer and prehistory of the Nakba. And I'm wondering if some of this discussion about World War I and its aftermath might throw light then on the origins, the historic origins of other tragedies.
Okay. My question is related almost exactly to that, but a little bit differently. But it's the way that Mughal also talked about violence in the Ottoman Empire, but also related to the... I'm sorry. The question is related. It has to do with long-term, since you've studied Buchach from the foundations. I mean, I've heard you talk about this project before. I'm very interested in how one deals with the question of long-term origins of violence between Poles, Ukrainians, and in this case, Jews as victims as well, but this Polish-Ukrainian conflict, and how you think about this problem, which Muga had brought up, and which now Derek has brought up in terms of the Palestinian-Ukrainian conflict. How do you deal with this? I mean, how do you analyze the depth of the problem, or how contingent it is, and that kind of thing? I've struggled with that thing myself, unsuccessfully, I have to say.
Why don't you take the one?
Sure. Well, these are related, of course. I'm Israeli and all, but I'm not an expert on the origins of the Nakba. So what I say is just what I think. If we try to relate these, I mean, I was thinking when you asked your question about Segev's book, One Palestine Complete, which tries to describe a different alternative world that was happening in the 1920s and 1930s. That's after World War I, of course. I don't think, let me put it that way, I think that in the case of Buchach, and not just Buchach, but this whole region, of course, World War I is crucial. And I think that it's largely been ignored. I mean, there has been writing about it, but it doesn't somehow tend to be related to the violence that occurs later on. And there's a greater predilection to speak about the period of the Soviet occupation of 39-41. But it's really, when you read the accounts of the immense amount of violence that is occurring during World War I and it's in its immediate aftermath, then you realize that this is so close to the events later on. Most of these people are still living. They've experienced that. That gives license to violence on a completely different scale. Now that relates also to the other question, because there is one tendency to say, well, what are the immediate causes of violence? And there's another that says, well, in this region, that's the sort of things that happen. That's a problem from hell, right? It just happens. And here, people relate to earlier period of violence, such as the 17th century, whereas in fact, the actual violence, that is the violence that occurs from 1914 to 18 and then immediately afterwards in 1919 to 1921, that is the real violence, but it's related then also to one that was not experienced but is remembered and has been internalized as a model for violence. That's what I liked about that dissertation by Lada, by this guy. Now, in the case of the Nakba, I think the violence is not World War I violence, it's the violence that begins, I suspect, in the 1930s. It is that has to be linked, and then to that you have to link World War II. And there are a lot of people, we also tend to forget, there are a lot of people who, such as my father, for instance, right, who went to fight in a war, right, in World War II. So when they come back from that war, they've already been in a war. They've already experienced killing and a license to killing, and not just any killing. They were in World War II. They're fighting the Nazis. So that kind of internalization of violence and then directing it at another source and associating that source with the other, that is basically associating violence against Palestinians with violence against Germans, is very much there. I have no question about that, but I don't believe, and I may be wrong because there are a lot of experts here, I don't believe that anyone has actually carefully analyzed that. And I think it should be. So now, that relates to sort of long-term. What I'm trying to do, and I may totally fail, I don't know, but what I'm trying to do is to tell the three narratives of this place. This town has three histories, at sometimes more than three. But most of the time it has three. It has a Polish, Ukrainian, and Jewish history. They tell completely different stories about the same place. And they tell them over time. And as I said, these stories don't necessarily conflict with each other. They're just different. It's as if they're talking about a different place. In times of crisis, and in remembering times of crisis, the differences between these three stories really kick in. They really matter. And so when you have violence in 1919, people talk about Khmelnytsky, but they talk about him totally differently. The Jews say, Gewalt, it's again, it's the Cossacks. The Ukrainians say, now we're finally creating the Cossack state, we'll have our own state. The Poles say, well, that's the rabble coming against the Polish state. So there, these narratives come into play. It doesn't mean that it has to happen that way. It's entirely contingent. There's no reason that that would have happened. Without the German army coming into Galicia, or into many other parts, but into Galicia, in 1941, there would not have been a genocide there. There would have been a lot of killing, but there would not have been a genocide. But because they came in, the genocide had the character that it had, also because of all of these memories, ideologies, what people expected others to do and expected to do to others.
Yes.
I'm sorry, I don't think.
Thank you for a wonderful talk, very powerful, and it brings a lot of issues, and I want to touch on a couple. One is in combination of the dialogue with Derek and what you said about about the 30s. I think that it starts earlier, the kind of projecting the situation of Eastern Europe on the situation in Palestine, and doing the, kind of line of continuity from the non-Jew or the Muslim or whatever and the Arabs. So there's evidence about it beforehand. There's no doubt that then the transition from World War II to 1948 dramatizes it further. But my main question is actually if you can talk more about the methodology of studying history through memory, which is to say, because what happened there is not part of the official historical narrative. There are all kinds of alternative sites of, I would say, memory, but it actually is then what you reconstruct history throughout. And I thought about the analogy of what Alon did in the article that eventually he didn't talk about, but about Tantura. And that is to say, it's a history that is known by the people who were part of there, but it did not enter the official records of history. So there are only those alternative places where you can go, and then the line between history and memory becomes diffused. It's a matter of a judgment by historian, what you take to be history and what you think that belongs to memory.
Actually, mine dovetails beautifully with that one, because I wanted to, of course, put in a word, a good word for memoirs, because memoirs do point out to what is culturally meaningful to the people in a way that you do not get through official history. And in my case, I put that together with William Sewell Jr.'s eventful approach. It would be very interesting because he argues that there are certain events in which people define, in our case, their victimhood or their, or which gives them almost license then to become perpetrators. And in the Ottoman, Turkish case, it is very interesting that, for example, before 1915, it starts in 1878 with the Ottoman Russia War, where Ottomans are devastated, and most of the parents of the Union and Progress perpetrators were actually forcefully deported because of that war. Then on top of that, they were all sent to the Balkans. Then there is the 1911-13 Balkan Wars, where they are once more forcefully deported into the Ottoman Empire. And that sort of victimhood somehow thought that it sort of gave them the license to then practice destruction against the Armenians, in the Ottoman Empire, who were not the Christians who sort of destroyed them in the first place. So there is this bizarre projection that occurs. So I thought, that would be very similar to what you're talking in your case about, what happened in your town, Buchach, and also, of course, the Nakba. I think it would be very interesting to look at it that way. Thank you.
We'll take one more and then...
I can continue because you said you could only write the history of this town with using these documents. My question is theoretical, using documents. What could you have said about this town only using the official documents from the different groups involved officially, German Wehrmacht, authorities and so on about this town? And the second is how to deal with this kind of different, so to say, ego or memoirs or with all the differences. There are some, so to say, efforts to establish archives for these voices, and I think to have an archive where you can put your story, so to say, to be acknowledged, to be known by other people, who it might be, is a kind of infrastructure which gives acknowledgements. Even if nothing happens, yes, you can bring your story to a kind of authority. So that might also be a step to acknowledge the stories of the others.
Okay, we have one more on this thing.
Yeah, I think the point you made that the Nakba in the 1948 has to be contextualized in terms of the violence in the late 30s and the perception by the Jewish community in Palestine of that violence, the publicity that was given to desecrated bodies, and on top of that, the Holocaust. So then what you have in 1948 is the conviction of the Jewish community in Palestine that the Palestinians are potentially genocidal. And since they're potentially genocidal, therefore we are going to make sure that this is not going to happen in any way. Now, whether that's a true or a false perception, probably false. But the perception is clear on the basis of the immediate history. You're not going to take any risks.
Okay, thank you. Let me go in reverse order. So yes, I think that's what I haven't thought about this enough. I have to say, but sitting here, this conference, I think there is something that we haven't quite figured out, and I think part of it is, yes, even a pre-World War II sense of looming danger and violence. I'm talking about a perception, not about the reality. On top of which is not only the knowledge of what is happening, but experience. And I'll get back to that. It's not just hearing, it's not just remembering, it's experiencing violence, being soldiers, being in wars. That sort of license that is given to killing, you know, all societies know that when warriors come back from war, they need a time to readjust. But in modern times, we don't do that, right? People come back and they come back as they were. And that sort of both conception and experience, I think, have to be seen as part of what actually occurs during 48. But maybe someone should do a PhD on that, as we always say. On the documentation, so let me say a few things, because I may not have been clear enough in the paper. This is very short. I have not written a book, or am not writing a book, that is only based on ego documents. I have thousands of official documents, Polish documents, Russian documents, German documents, Austrian documents, official documents. In fact, I have all the official documents that I could find on this town, everything that I could find. There's some that I may not have found. That's why it's taken me so long. And I will use as many of them as I can within, reason. So I'm not saying that I'm trying to write only an ego history of the town, or that I'm writing about the memory of the town. I'm writing the history of that town. And I have years ago decided that I want to write a history. And a history in the sense also from the beginning to the end. And I want to write a sort of total history of a very small place. That is, everything that there is about it. And part of what there is about it is the voices of the people in it. And my conceit is indeed to use as many of the voices as I can, but to integrate them into the history of the place. Not to talk about them as memory unless they are that, but to talk about them as voices reporting to us their experience of the history of that place. So when I write, say, about which would be a very big part, about 41 to 44, I will use whatever I can. And there are official documents about it. There aren't that many. One thing that I discovered is that the best book on the Holocaust in Eastern Galicia by the German historian Dieter Pohl, which is based mostly on German official documentation and some Polish and Ukrainian, but mostly German, gets a lot of things wrong because he didn't use so-called Jewish sources. And many of these sources are so-called subjective sources because they're people who said what happened. And he ignores them because he only wants to see what the perpetrators said happened, planned, and then carried out. And often the perpetrators cheat, and sometimes they just get it wrong. So that's about that. I would say in terms of archives of memory, we are blessed with exceptional archives that are extraordinarily underused. So in the Shoah Foundation, which is not far from here, about 500 miles south from here, in USC, well, here too, right? Yeah, because it's connected. There are 52,000 testimonies. In JICH, in the original collection of documentations in the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw, which also now is available everywhere in Washington, maybe here, I don't know, you have 7,200 testimonies collected right after the war. In fact, some of them before the war ended, already in 1944. In Yad Vashem, there's a very large collection. At Yale University, at the Fortunoff Archive, there are about 4,200 testimonies. So we have a lot, but they have not been used. And when they were used, they were usually used as anecdotes to give color to an account rather than to creating an account. Now, I will just add one thing to that because that was one of the points that I was making. We can use these personal accounts in a variety of ways, not to give color, but to give us a multidimensional understanding of what is happening. There are cases in which there's hardly any official documentation. And there, I think you should use them, as Carlo Ginzburg said a long time ago. I think you should use them. So for this period that I chose to talk about here, that is spring, summer 1944, there's hardly any official documents. Within the personal documents, what you find, and that's why I cited it here, is Jewish accounts of being rescued by Germans. Now, if these were German accounts, I would, think, okay, sure. What else would they say? But these are Jewish accounts, and it is an event that has totally disappeared from history. Between 400 and 600 Jews were saved by this single German Wehrmacht officer who was coming from the east in one town in Tuster. So most of the accounts that I have because he saved them. I wouldn't have had them otherwise. And they acknowledge that, only they didn't know his name. These are events that can be resurrected if you are a bit more respectful, to my mind, of those who testified, who did it not for the sake of memory. They did not give testimony because they thought memory is a good thing. They gave testimony because they wanted people to know what happened. They were talking to historians, and historians didn't want to listen. And that's why these testimonies stayed in archives. And I'm sure that is the case not only with the Holocaust, of course, but with many other cases of genocide and ethnic cleansing and other types of violence. I think I sort of responded to everything else too. So, yeah.
We're really just going to take one more question and then end this part up.
So, thanks, Omer. It was beautiful, and for I think obvious reasons I identify very much with this project. So I wanted to say actually something personal, that my trajectory to think about 1948 comes from my work in German history and in Holocaust history. And when I thought about people who were doing, new things, important things about the Holocaust, such as Omer, Friedlander, or Christopher Browning, about this everyday life existence of the perpetrators and the victims in close proximity, then I started to think about 48. I thought, the story of how the Palestinians left in 1948 in Israeli society is like, these people one day packed their things and they left. And yes, there were some stories about perhaps expulsion and massacre, but the idea that you have this close-knit connection between violence perpetrated by Jews and the living of the Arabs is something that that in Israeli society is not something obvious at all. And it is actually this trajectory from the Holocaust to 1948. Not that I'm saying, of course, that this is the same thing, but how I thought about it, that I thought that what we need to know is really the kind of questions, I spoke about it with Norman, who really called the trucks? How did the people, how did the Arabs were put on these trucks? What happened there? These are questions that are completely silent. What happened to the property? We know some things, but it's not something integrated as you beautifully said and showed us. These things are really, they happen. And we need to know how they happen there, and we need to know here. Something about the violence. I don't know if the Jews thought that the Arabs are potentially genocidal, but I do think that one context for the violence was the forced migrations that happened all over the world, and especially in Europe. The fact that Germans were expelled, 12 million Germans, the fact that homogeneous nation states were created in Europe, it was something that the Zionists were very aware of. And it was clearly that these forced migrations happened with the blessing of the international community. So it was not against the international community. And when we think about the partition resolution, so there were two states. The Jewish states had some 40% of its inhabitants a minority. 45. This 45% had owned most of the private land. If you look at the history of this kind of examples in the 20, 30 years before, and it's certainly in the 3, 4, 5 years before, we understand that moving one group was not something that came out of the sky. It had a certain context. It had an international context, an international legitimacy, and yeah, that's it.
Yeah, can you
I'll be
brief
here,
and then
yeah.
your
Okay,
answers on
sure.
close up this point?
One thing that impressed me in the presentation was the personal thing. It's touching, it's moving. And I have one comment and a question. It's one thing of a Jew, Israeli, speaking about the Nakba and writing the history of 1948, and a Palestinian doing exactly the same thing. And I think one thing about why this awareness of the Nakba is all of the thing about the new historians in Israel that came up and writing 1948 history, and it made a different impression from Palestinians who were saying almost the same thing before. I mean, Palestinians knew and were whining, but it's another thing when Benny Morris and Avi Schleim and all of the wave of the new historians were whining about it, it made a different thing. And this brings me to your talk. I heard here and there, and I'm curious to know about how history is documented by Jewish historians, and I'm not implying by any way it's not objective, but when you say something about this German officer, coming from Omer Bartov is something else when it comes from a German historian documenting the same thing. And I'm curious in terms of the evidence, because I think you're aware of it, and I would sense that historians are aware of this identity history, like identity politics. Is the methodology of checking evidence different because of the implication of it coming from this notable Jewish historian saying this German was okay, than when it's checked by a German historian?
Right. Okay, so let me start with that last question. So this is interesting, first of all, because I mean, what I started writing on, my dissertation was on crimes of the German army. And that made me somewhat notorious in Germany, and for a while I would come and give lectures in Germany, and the first few ranks of the people in the audience would be former Wehrmacht soldiers, and they'd say, no, it didn't happen, that's all lies. Now they've mostly passed, so it's their sons and daughters who are sitting there. And some of them carry the memory and even feel that they're still responsible to, protect the honor of the Wehrmacht. So, first of all, coming from me, to say that, both personally, but also people who know what I've written, will make some people raise an eyebrow, say, well, now he's actually writing. Now, I'm not saying nice things about the Germans in Buchach. I'm interested in this case. I think it is an interesting case, but it's exceptional, of course. German historians generally have argued in writing about National Socialism and the Holocaust that they do the best job of it. And that goes back a long time. I won't go into the whole story of the debate between Saul Friedlander and Martin Borchardt. There's a whole long, complicated story. The Germans said they use scholarly tools, whereas Jews write a mythical history of the Holocaust, which they're entitled to do. It's, of course, we respect it, but it's not really history. That may make you make another analogy, if you like. I won't make it, you can make it. But clearly there is this sort of what is myth and what is scholarship. That has changed over time. So now the issue for me would not be German historians. The issue for me is Polish and Ukrainian historians. And what I've published already on this, because a lot of this is about relations between Jews, Poles, and Ukrainians, is who am I to talk about that? So that is part of the problem. The other side of it, which I found extraordinary, really interesting, is that when I came to work in archives in Poland and in Ukraine in particular, and they assumed automatically, they thought I was American, maybe they thought I was Jewish, and they said, so you're looking for Jewish materials? And I said, no, I'm looking for Ukrainian, Polish, Jewish, whatever you have. People said, so you must be a serious scholar. You're not just looking. So there is clearly who you are plays a role. There's no question about it. Regarding what Alon was saying, let me just quote two things that will sort of indirectly refer to what you're saying. One is a passage in Benny Morris, who was just evoked in his big book on the expulsion of the Palestinians. He has a passage there which is from Golda Meir when she visits a place, a village that had been evacuated. And she writes there that it evokes in her memories of Ukraine. Haifa. Is it Haifa? Yeah. And she sees these empty streets, and she says, it reminds me of Ukraine. Now, if you try to think what is going on here, and then she says, well, this is very difficult for us to do, but we have to do it. So she ends up justifying. But she goes through this moment of linking the two in a variety of ways, both as justification and as guilt, because now she's on the other side after all. That to me is a moment that you can make a great deal of what is going on here. The second one is something I wrote years ago, a little piece, because going to these Ukrainian towns, what struck me, of course, is seeing there were remnants of synagogues, there were cemeteries, they were serving as marketplaces or just for grazing, for goats, many of them, and cows, and that there was complete indifference to all these sites of a former civilization that disappeared. And some people I asked about it, and they said, well, one of them said to me, who is a curator of a museum in Lviv, said, well, that's what happens to all civilizations. Look at the Romans, the Greeks. And it was this sense of time. I said, well, my grandfather still lived there, It's not like the ancient Rome. It's very close. So I tried to understand the mentality, and then I remembered where I grew up. And I spent my childhood in Ramat Aviv. And Ramat Aviv was where as I told Michael, where the Polacks lived. And many of the kids that I grew up with were from the Gomulka immigration. So they were, at home they spoke Polish, the so-called immigration. In Shahmunis, which had been a Palestinian village, which was evacuated, there were the Moroccans. They were not Arab Moroccans, they were Jewish Moroccans. And we, Polacks, had fights with the Moroccans, with knife Moroccans. This was my childhood. And we never thought of that being an Arabic village. It was, of course, where the Sfardis lived. And so I suddenly understood that this was years, I'm talking about the late 50s. This is not such a long time after the event. And it had already been rewritten, re-scripted, and the experience of a young person like me was entirely uninformed by any of that. And that's something that, you know, that's what is incumbent on us, not just to tell the memory, to actually write the history of those events. So.
Thank you. We're going to move on to our second speaker, Mitchell Cohen. And do you need to say anything? Okay, Mitchell Cohen teaches political science at Batoch College and the Graduate School in the City University of New York. He was the longtime co-editor of Dissent magazine and writes for many publications that we're all familiar with, the New York Times Book Review and the New Republic. His books include Zion and State and The Wager of Lucien Goldman.
First, in the spirit of the conversation of this morning, I have to ask your forgiveness in advance. If my head moves around a bit, it's because even after 2 years, I'm not quite used to bifocals, and it's not. I'm not going to be falling asleep on my own words, but trying to see them. I guess one is history and the other is memory. So, in November 2011, at Ben Gurion Airport, an exchange took place between an Israeli in her mid-20s and an American in his late 50s. Her job, security, his professing. He was returning to New York after giving a lecture and spending some time with friends. He handed his passport to the young soldier, assigned to security, and she asked him questions familiar to non-Israelis who have flown in and out of the Jewish state. How long have you been in Israel? What do you do? Do you have family here? Where did you stay? Was it your first visit? He answered, a week, professor of political science, no family here, stayed with friends, and had been to the country many times. Why did you come this time, she asked. He responded to give a talk at Hebrew University. She didn't ask about what, and he didn't volunteer the subject, since it was a tender one for Jewish memory and history, Richard Wagner. Do you speak Hebrew, she asked. Yes, he said, but it's rusty. Where'd you learn it? He said at Hebrew University in 1972 and 73. And then she asked him, why did you want to study there? He was stumped by this question. And then she was stumped by his answer, because I belonged to a left-wing organization that wanted to turn the world into a kibbutz. Were there ever any left-wingers who were sympathetic to Israel, she asked. Yes, he replied. A good many of the founders of this country called themselves socialists or social democrats. Not really, she asked. The astonishment was genuine. Really, he said. And then refrained from going into the history of the man whose airport was named, in which they were standing, who had been the head of unions and workers' parties, this and that. And by then the travelers on the line to the plane were getting anxious, and she urged him on. I begin with this story because my remarks today focus on a turning point in Israeli political history. I've called it 1977. I'm really only dealing with the question of the change in Israeli politics, not the second part of 1977, which would be Sadat's trip to Jerusalem. And it really refers to much broader processes than can be encapsulated by naming a year. I approach it as a political scientist who's often accused of being too historical and don't object to it, but also with a type of social democratic preoccupation. Our concern at this conference is, in a way, the clash of narratives and implications for reconciliation between antagonists. I want to look at clashes within Israel, focusing particularly on the meaning of a major domestic event, the defeat in elections of a party that had dominated and shaped Israeli politics for Zionist politics before then for half a century. The Likud, led by Menachem Begin, then replaced the Labor Party in Israel's government. The first time the right wing had been able to do so. The attainment of power brought its attainment of power brought more than a policy change, but changes in political culture and the constellation of values and attitudes, indeed memories that characterized citizens in their relation to their polity. It came with attempts by the newly empowered right to redress what it saw as a grave grievance, the refusal to give proper due historical credit to what it believed was its central role in the story of Israel's creation. Begin's movement, the revisionists, which in 1977 was the largest component of the Likud and the new coalition, had long complained that it had been marginalized in the narrative preferred by the long dominant party, a party that had never obtained majorities, but whose consistent pluralities allowed it to be seen as the natural leader. In simplest form, this narrative, which I'll call simply the labor narrative, although there are important variants in it, held that Zionism aimed to transform Jews from a precarious diaspora existence into Am Oved, a working nation, a self-determining working nation in its own state. The vehicle for this metamorphosis was a labor movement inspired by collectivist ideals, a sense of practicality, institutions like the kibbutz and the histadrut, which helped to integrate Jewish immigrants into the yishuv as darkness consumed Europe. This movement, animated significantly by ideas and vocabulary derived from the left in Europe and Russia, had defeated the extremists of the Zionist right in the 1930s, and for the most part knew when it was intelligent to compromise and when it was unintelligent to make bombastic declarations demanding maximalist goals. The labor narrative painted the politics of Mapai, the principal predecessor of labor, as a combination of judiciousness and toughness, committed to socialist or social democratic notions, but recognizing a singularity in Jewish circumstances due to virulent anti-Semitism in Europe. It's a narrative that I'm sure many of you have heard. The consequence of it was, of course, that Mapai's Ben-Gurion read the Jewish state's Declaration of Independence, led it through the War of Independence, became its first prime minister. Mapai had defeated the leader of the right, Vladimir Jabotinsky, in the 30s, outmaneuvered his movement's violence and extremism in the 40s, and then confined it after statehood. The most vociferous challenge to the Mapai or the labor narrative that most of us are used to outside of Israel came not from the Zionist right, but from the historians who are generally called now the new historians, who tilt to the left, and they included political scientists and sociologists, sometimes called post-Zionists, not all of them, from the 1980s and 1990s. And it's safe to say that they challenged, most significantly, the labor narrative. What's interesting, though, is they are challenging at the same time that the Labor Party has been defeated politically. The revisionist narrative, on the other hand, claimed that the charismatic maximalist Jabotinsky was Israel's true founder, a man of uncanny foresight, particularly concerning the Holocaust. It also depicted the revolt of the Irgun, led by Menachem Begin, against the British in the spring of 1944 as the crucial step to Israeli independence. Jabotinsky, who died in 1940, in fact had misread radically a number of major things, part of which was his own faith in London. If you study what he's advocating in the 1930s, he's advocating a petition campaign across Europe directed at London, which he believes will change its views and make it more Zionist again. As late as 1938, Jabotinsky predicted a wave of liberalism across Europe within the next 5 years. These, of course, had to be bracketed, and Begin's tendency to misread political circumstances was also notable. The Ergons Revolt took place just a little while before D-Day, and it's at least arguable, I would say surely, that the priority of Jews at that moment was the defeat of Hitler. Nonetheless, one of the things to realize is that types of grand gestures, an emphasis on pride, daring, and arms took central places in the revisionist narrative. Begin's movement put enormous store in dramatic symbolism, as well as historical legacies. The intensity and the long-lasting nature of these can be seen from the furies unleashed during Begin's second government in the early 1980s concerning a murder that happened half a century before. In June 1933, Chaim Arlazarov, political secretary of the Jewish Agency, perhaps the best mind of the Zionist left, was assassinated in Tel Aviv. Figures from an extremist, revisionist-oriented group were arrested. They insisted that they were innocent, but many on the left continued to believe in their guilt even after they were released for lack of corroborating evidence. When in 1982, scholar journalist Shabtai Tevet published a book on Arlazarov's murder, a historical reexamination suggesting that the accused were guilty after all, the Begin government ordered a state commission to reinvestigate the crime. By the time its report was published, Begin was no longer prime minister, but few were surprised that it found the accused innocent. That a government paid for a commission to rebut a book in the midst of war in Lebanon, in the midst or the aftermath of the war, and a whole series of economic crises may seem astonishing, but not really considering the emphasis on historical legacy that played an important role in Israeli politics. As Pierre Noram remarks, his references to France, of course, the history of history cannot be innocent. The new narrative of the new historians of the 1980s was actually not that much of a novelty, not even within Israel. Aharon Cohen's controversial book, Israel and the Arab World, published over a quarter century earlier, had, for instance, presented a much more complex, both politically and morally, portrait of the flight of the Palestinian refugees in 1948 than the mainstream labor narrative had allowed. New historians contested the Mapai interpretation of history by seeking to show or arguing that Zionist hands were not entirely clean, or that Zionism ought to be subsumed under the same categories as European colonialism, for examples. The brief of these scholars against the labor narrative can perhaps be encapsulated by a quote, the charge that, quote, those in power, both in Zionism and in Israel, have been deliberately and systematically falsifying Jewish and Zionist history, unquote. True scholarship, then, rectifies this, and it's often been supposed that what I will call an enabling condition, the opening of archives pertaining to the 48 war, you have a curious intersection of the defeat of the Labor Party and just afterwards the opening of the of archives concerning 48 because of a 30-year rule come together in a rather interesting way. And thus you have people like Benny Morris, who didn't consider himself a post-Zionist, arguing that historians before had not been objective or didn't have the means of objectivity, while he was. Others like Avi Shleim argued, contended that they had never intended to revise historical narratives, but new documents led them to do it. However, one judges the various contributions of these writers, there's often a peculiar positivism about them. And writing history, at least to me, is never simply a matter of opposing facts to ideology, although this trope is often present. Now, I'll have to beg your indulgence on something else. I did a little bit of a ruse in citing that rather strong hyperbolic statement, quote, those in power, both in Zionism and in Israel, have been deliberately and systematically falsifying Jewish and Zionist history. This quote is out of context. The words come not from one of the new historians. It comes from Joseph Shechtman, Vladimir Jabotinsky's secretary and biographer, and Yehuda Ben-Ari, his collaborator on a 1970 history of the Zionist right, which they believed had been denied its say by the dominant party. Nevertheless, one can find something interesting here, imagining that the same criticism made here from two different directions. Another element needs to be added for proper contextualization, which I think also entails understanding what happens in 1977. The new historians arose after labor fell. the Shechtman-Ben Ari statement came before. Indeed, it came following 3 years in which the right, the revisionists, for the first time finally got to serve in a government, meaning the National Unity Government between 1967 and 1970. And political scientists will often tell you that participation in governmental responsibilities with a dominant party is one way a party that has been excluded from power gets to legitimize itself and give the appearance of being a responsible party of government. When the dominant party fell, finally, its legacy came under assault by both the right-wing leaders, although it's a complicated matter since the first Begin government was a coalition that was not entirely on the right, as well as the new historians. The idea of a dominant party comes from a classic in political science, Maurice Duverger's study Political Parties from 1951. It served as a key tool for a generation of Israeli political scientists and sociologists, Asher Ari and Yonatan Shapira, who preceded the new historians. Dominance for Duverger meant political sway based not on majorities, but on a combination of electoral pluralities over an extended time, together with a party's identification with an epic, often a particularly eventful one. And you can see how Mapai and Labor fit into this. Antonio Gramsci's notion of hegemony bears certain similarities to this. Both Duverger and Gramsci were concerned, among other things, with how dominance or hegemony reproduces itself through politics, culture, institutions. And Duverger proposed that a single electoral defeat, for whatever reasons, makes what had seemed inconceivable conceivable, and what was assumed suddenly can collapse, particularly when a party has been identified with an epic. Then the victorious party is usually concerned to reshape, if not reinvent, history to enhance its own legitimacy. Labor's loss didn't result in an immediate Likud dominance. The 1981 elections were vigorously competitive. Either side might have won. Labor and the Likud were virtually even in the 84 elections. But Labor's dominance was over. Even if it first believed after 1977 that this has just been a blip on the historical screen and would soon change. There are different explanations of the historical how and why of 1977. I'm going to leave aside the right-wing one, which assumes that it was a teleology, that Begin was naturally the right should naturally be the head of the government, or the Labor one that assumed that it was just a blip. It seems to me there are a couple of other important explanations that need to be mixed, and obviously we don't have time to go over all of them. First, the obvious one, that any party that is in power for as long as Labor had been will inevitably fracture, will probably become corrupt in many ways and fall. Unless a society remains improbably static, turnover will eventually take place in a democratic system, because parties rest finally on varied and changing social forces in coalitions, and a party has to adapt to them. Even if a party has earned special charisma by virtue of its identification with an epic, charisma becomes routinized, and lacking significant internal renewal, a party will become brittle and potentially break. Another possible explanation is that Labor suffered from the long-term consequences of policies pursued in its first years in the name of what was called mamlachtiyut. It's a hard word to translate from Hebrew. It derives from the word kingdom. In practical policies, it meant subordinating the institutions of the labor movement to those of the state. Israel may be the only case where a Labor Party came to power and nationalized labor institutions rather than capitalist ones. It also meant changes in other important areas, such as education and the nationalizing of a labor education system. in a country devoted to immigration, which means and Israel had indeed its population doubled and then tripled, a dominant party yielding or weakening a key institution like political socialization has important implications. And if you combine that with the resentments of the Mizrahi Jews coming in the 1950s, you begin to, and who also didn't experience the heroic, what was seen as the heroic period of declaring statehood, you can see how this will help cause a problem. In addition, labor eventually became less cohesive. There were a variety of specific political problems in the 1960s and 70s, which we can go into more in questions if we want. Labor had a crisis of succession. You had leading figures feeling they couldn't get ahead in the Labor Party, going to the army, then going back into politics, parachuting into the top of the party without the usual political tools. You see this in the conflicts, in a way. In Rabin's first term as prime minister in the 70s, when the government is bifurcated between military and party men, and the party is weakened. And then there are all sorts of contingencies, scandals, as everybody who studied the period will recall. The mere fact that Menachem Begin had a heart attack not very long before the election, and that his, how shall we say it, his speechifying manners, which often frightened a lot of people, were thus not there part of the time, may have played an impact. And then there was an important split where some labor and other centrist forces formed something called the Democratic Movement for Change, most of whose vote came from the labor vote. You put that all together and you begin to see a circumstance where dramatic change is possible. One other very critical element, of course, is the long-term effect of the trauma of the 1973 war, which hadn't fully registered in the December 73 elections, but the longer-term shock of that did settle in. This list is only partial, but it gives, I hope, a picture of steady weakening of labor. Now, I want to complicate this in one other way, and a way that needs a lot more research. I've mostly described this in terms of an internal dynamic within Israel. But consider the fact that Israel was not the only social democratic party that failed at this time or lost at this time. An entirely different dimension is added if we think of labor's 1977 debacle in another context, the general unraveling of social democratic parties elsewhere. Let me just give you a few examples. 1976, the Swedish Social Democratic Party lost finally after 4 decades of dominance of Sweden. If you study the way it built coalitions and policies in the 1930s and 40s leading to its own dominance, it bears some interesting similarities to the Zionist labor movement. And only on a few occasions did it ever get more than 50% of the vote. Most European social democratic parties never usually got in the 40s in the same way as Labour did in Israel. The Labour Party in Britain, which was never dominant in the same way, also loses in 1979, unable to master the crisis of the welfare state, and its share of the vote drops dramatically. And there's an interesting thought, I have an interesting thought about the United States as well. The New Deal coalition was, of course, not really social democratic, but it was probably the closest that we've come to a type of social democratic coalition in American politics. And that also is what collapses in the 1970s, rather. Some of you who may remember this ancient history recall that at the end of Carter's term as president, Carter was challenged by Edward Kennedy on behalf of ideals that were associated more with long-term liberalism than in collapse. You had a collapse of the New Deal coalition, a decline in the role of unions, now Americans seem to forget why there was a New Deal and are told that Reagan was its heir. So I think an entirely different dimension to the failure of labor in Israel, the defeat there, can perhaps be teased out talking about a more general problem. Serious research on it would also have to include interesting historiographical questions, such as what type of historiographical changes, what sort of changes came about in the writing of history, and both academically, but also in terms of political movements, self-understanding. I tried to find out a little bit about this in Sweden last week. Unfortunately, I don't read Swedish, so I can't. I'm rather limited in what I can say, but I corresponded with a few scholars, and there doesn't seem to have been a major historiographical reconsideration of the role, certainly not within the ranks of the leadership of the Social Democrats there. So let me end on this note to say that I think we have to think about this major political shift. The fact that the founding narrative of Israel became besieged by thinking of all sorts of matters. Part of it entails the right wing coming to power at the same time of a period. You have a long period of decline, new historians on the left, social democracy, the Labor Party running on empty, really, for a long time, and intellectual empty. And then a whole other change comes about because of Sadat's visit, where the external environment then changes dramatically, which would take some rather more time for me to address. So let me stop there and try to answer any questions you have.
That was really interesting, and all your shift towards the end to a wider angle view I found absolutely compelling. I think it's astonishing seeing that kind of wave of movement away from what in Britain we call the old Labour paradigm, right across, broadly speaking, the West. And it's an interesting thing that in that narrative Israel gets caught up very closely with that movement. Just one way I might venture to suggest a development of the sort of thing you're saying in terms of how to understand that unravelling would be this. Thinking very generally, a liberal thinker is going to think that our life is full of competing interests in different domains, and a neoliberal thinker thinks that one of the domains should take charge. And the story of Europe's modernity and the modernity of the West is an idea of political neoliberalism. That is, say, if we're going to resolve the problems of life, politics should be in charge, and it's the politics of emancipation and so on. And then what happens in the post-war period is a shift from a collective political discourse to one of individuated, economized consumer society, which is essentially a movement of one neoliberal paradigm into another, from a political neoliberalism, or political emancipation, to an economic neoliberalism that says that the way we should understand our life will be through discourses with basically an economic model, and you apply that to the whole of life. Now, understanding why that happened, I don't know, but it seems to me that one could encompass that amazing trajectory of unravelling that you described in those sorts of terms.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very good point. I would complicate it in the following way. Both labor in Israel and the right wing were preoccupied with creating a state. So the role and place of statism and what it means, which is also very fundamental in the thinking of much of European social democracy, becomes a very complicated and interesting problem, particularly if labor and its right-wing opponents have two different concepts of what the state should be. Second, the leadership of labor after Rabin is forced to resign and becomes Shimon Peres, who had a traditional career of strong opposition to those sort of old labor and old social democratic values. Not anti-state, on the contrary. He was a great advocate of Ben-Gurion's version of statism, mamlachtiyut, but part of a group that was extremely critical of the old social democratic ideas and movement. And he writes an article for Haaretz in the early 80s called New Socialism, which actually seems in many ways to anticipate the sort of things you see with Tony Blair. And there was a controversy just 3 or 4 years ago. Well, the headline is from Haaretz, Labor irate over Peres's claim that the party never aimed to be socialist. Peres was by then, there's a peculiar pattern in Israeli history of people who had been leaders of parties quitting those parties. Not just members, but leaders. And Peres at this point was the number 2 for Kadima and had given a speech essentially saying that. And one of the most remarkable figures out of labor history, Lova Eliav, responded with enormous irritation, pointing out, among other things, that Peres had been the vice president of something called the Socialist International, which had met the previous year in Tel Aviv. So to go back to your point, yeah, it's complicated, and a full treatment of that would have to deal, one, with these different notions of the state. Second of all, part of the Likud derives from the Israeli liberals, who are liberals in the European sense, not in the American sense. And one of the transformations that we've seen in Israel in the last decades is indeed a dramatic liberalizing of the economy, tremendous weakening of the trade unions, the Histadrut. So I think all of that would have to be factored in.
We'll take two. Start with Amin.
I was wondering if you include in your account also the shifting of what's called in Israel the Arab voice. So how do Palestinians living in Israel with Israeli citizenship change their political agency as of 1977, moving onward until today?
Yeah, you know, the political agency of Israeli Arabs was often structured as an appendage to labor when it was a dominant party. I think that one can, I'm not an expert on the politics of the Arab sector, but of course there's a certain exclusion that was always there. You know, if you look at the question of equality in Israeli society, Israel is one of the most egalitarian societies in the world at the end of the 1960s and the early 70s, if you don't factor in entirely the Arab sector. Now, the inegalitarian is everywhere, and Israeli Arabs, many of whom now prefer to be called Palestinian Israelis or Israeli Palestinians, have, I think, had a change in political attitudes, and there's been much more of a mobilization of, there were several, of course, violent clashes between authorities and protesting Israeli Arabs. So some of that goes back earlier. My guess is that an adequate study of it would show an intensification of this after 1977, but not an absence beforehand.
A bit on recent attempts by Likud to change the Israeli historical memory of domestic politics through institutions like the Begin Institute and the raising of the Altalena. It seems like there's a lot going on, not just in terms of changing the economy and society and politics, but also changing the way Israelis think about their own their own domestic past.
Right, well, I think that's actually quite important. I was originally going to, I was worried about the amount of time I would have, so I was going to mention the Altalena, which also, the Altalena was a ship of arms. Altalena was Jabotinsky's pen name. And in June 1848, when there was this, 1948, excuse me, so I spent too much time on social democratic history, writ large. In June 1948, Begin attempts to bring a ship filled with arms, and there's a certain number of immigrants on it as well, in contrary to the orders of the government. And Ben-Gurion orders the boat to be sunk. Rabin was in charge of the unit that did it. After that, Begin, there's a dispute as to why this was done, and there are different arguments about it. In Shimon Peres's recent biography of Ben-Gurion, he has a very lengthy surprise. I was quite surprised at the extent to which he goes, the amount of space he devotes to discussing this and justifying what Ben-Gurion did. You have the issue of what the Altalena affair meant as an ongoing issue, but in fact, Derek, I'm sure you recall, right in the early 80s, who was it who wrote a book on the Altalena? Nakdimun. Presenting essentially a revisionist-leaning view of it. And now there's discussion of, I don't know what they're going to find by raising the remains of the boat up, but it's an attempt to change the way. Begin had always presented himself as saying that he saved the country for a civil war, and he didn't respond to this act of violence by Ben-Gurion. The opposite point of view was that this made sure that that the right wing, which had been armed, was going to be obedient to one government and have one command in an army, and that's the sort of issue. And so again, it makes rewriting it makes Begin a competitive hero to Ben-Gurion in the founding narrative, and I think that's and the current Prime Minister of Israel, of course, comes from a family with deep ties to Jabotinsky and preoccupations with history. Right? Yes.
Knowing very little about Israeli history, but nevertheless, I was very interested in the continuities and diffusion, in a sense, in the Turkish context, with respect to the Armenians. In rewriting our history, we drew a lot on the new historiography of Israel. Mm-hmm. I mean, that was very informative in sort of getting us to do something similar. Given that is the case, do you know of any instances where there was, I was wondering, I mean, when these such movements are discussed, some people argue that there are global movements, there are certain cohorts. I mean, there is a certain generational change that leads to this. I mean, you know, it's no accident that, you know, just as this was happening in Israel, there was also a generation in Turkey that was willing to sort of undertake something as well. So can one argue that, I mean, you obviously tied it to labor, but can maybe one tie it to a larger global movement of the shift, especially of, you know, the social democratic to later, so neoliberalism from political to economic and such?
Yeah, I think one of the reasons I made that comparison with those other social democratic labor parties is you can ascribe it to a generational question. I think that's only part of the issue. But in fact, there's one of the political scientists I mentioned, Yonatan Shapiro, wrote a book, I don't think it's been translated, called An Elite Without Successors. He wrote this, it's somewhere around 1980, I don't remember exactly. And so there is that question, but that's also a question that was played out within labor. Mm-hmm. And part of the split in the mid-60s, which entailed one old person, which was Ben-Gurion splitting from his party, but bringing a number of younger people, like Peres and Dayan, who are unsympathetic in many ways to traditional social democracy. And then Peres finally becomes the head of the party. So there is a generational question, but I also think there's a historical conjuncture, and there's also just another question of the whole world, intellectual world of European social democracy running on empty for a long time, which, by the way, I wouldn't say is entirely true with the Swedes, but nonetheless. That, I think, is rather important, and some of the changes toward neoliberalism actually take place with social democratic parties in power in a lot of Europe, which I don't think someone like Peres would be unsympathetic to. And I won't mention Bill Clinton.
Just a quick question of information, and excuse my ignorance, but thinking about the 48, the Nakba, the expulsion, does it really matter whether Labor or Likud looks at this? I mean, do we have a different point of view? Do we have a that would be a very complicated question on a lot of levels, and I can't answer it simply. It was the Irgun that did Dir Yassin, right? And I think most intelligent accounts of that period, and I'm not an expert on the war itself, point to that massacre as a rather important moment in creating a panic among Palestinian Arabs. It's rather understandable. So it doesn't matter. Well, that gets complicated by other questions. The Zionist leadership under Ben-Gurion accepted the principle of partition. If the Arab side had accepted partition, maybe there would have been another outcome. So there are so many maybes involved. In any event, it's very clearly not the case, and that's not a very good answer. But I do think it makes a difference.
You do have another point, that your post-Zionist historians became post-Zionist after 1977 because, in a way, the left was out of power. That's a subliminal explanation.
What's the relationship? In other words, what exactly is the relationship to the fact that now the left is out of power?
That means they're no longer hegemonic. They're no longer.
So they suppressed in some ways the historiography of the 48.
They suppressed. They ran out of power, emancipated them to go looking for alternative histories.
As the revisionists felt that they had to rewrite the history as well. So there's a, if you think of the combination of a long-term decline, a right-wing political victory, and a labor responding to it without many resources, intellectual resources, political resources. I think that's quite important in understanding what happened in 1977, and as important as the '73 war was in undercutting confidence in labor. I suspect that if one thinks of the decline of social democratic parties horizontally, rather just within Israel, they're also, that it's likely at a certain point labor would have either been transformed into something else or would have eventually declined. Remember, at the same time, you do have a process by which the right sought to legitimize itself. And there's actually a whole interesting literature about how excluded parties legitimize themselves. One classic case that's been written about, actually in comparison to Israel, is Italy, where the Christian Democrats never let the communists into power in the post-war period, because once you serve as part of a government, then the voting population begins to think, well, okay, maybe they're okay in a way that a dominant party doesn't want. Right? The German Social Democrats serve in a type of unity in a grand coalition, right, from 66 to 69, which is very important in enabling them to finally get the chancellorship. So, and the same thing with, Begin forms an alliance with the Liberal Party, which had been independent before the 60s, and then serving in a government for 3 years. And so there's a legitimation process combined with the process of decline.
Just a quick comment. I think that we shouldn't underestimate the generational change rather than the political changes as the leading factors in the shifting of the historiography. I mean, the fact that you have as an independent variables, I don't know that you can play one against the other, but would you say that with the assumption that if the labor didn't lose in 77, there wouldn't have been a change in the historiography in the 80s?
I think there probably, remember, it's not just only tied to the change in government, it's also tied to the archival question, although I have some problems with that, because then one loses sight of the fact that one doesn't write political history just on the basis of documents. The point that that was made in the previous session about that is, I think, is very, very important. It's a question of how you put information together. It's also plausible. One would have to. One of the arguments against the new historians was that they looked at the documents on one side but didn't have access to the documents on the other side, so couldn't quite. That has an effect on how you judge actions. It seems to me that the new historians represent a kind of a paradigm change, and I don't believe that one can take those things and just remove them from what's going on in the political world. Just to give you one other example, which I can't fully, I don't think these things can be connected simply one-to-one. But you know, and in this case, it's a shift from a case where you have a shift from right to left, right? Throughout all the 1980s, there's a historiography debate in France, leading up to a great commemoration. The 1989 is a celebration of the French Revolution. The debate, in sharpest terms, you put François Furet on one side, who in his mind connects 1789, but certainly 1793 to 1917. Right? On the other side, you have someone like Vauvel, who who's in fact a communist and admiring the legacy of it. But what's going on politically? While this debate is going on, you have the first socialist government under the Fifth Republic. You have a switch in the government in 1986. And then you have 1989, which also has revolutionary impact in another part of Europe. And so it's not a question of saying one-to-one. This happens, then that happens. But the notion, and I guess I'm a little too Hegelian for this, the notion that you can extract how people are understanding history from what's going on in the history around them is that's a long argument, and it's not something that I would accept.
No, but I think that what you do point out to, I think with the examples that you, is the more critical, general critical approach on the nationalist narrative in different countries that is going on at the same time. And it's not necessarily just a national story, it's not just a domestic story.
In the same way that it's not necessarily the case that in the way I connected to what happened to the labor parties, there's a change in historiography and sociology in the United States, and that becomes quite dominant, the rise of post-colonial theory and things like that. But those don't happen out of the blue. Right.
I'm going to take one more comment.
And related to that, I mean, one of the major things that happened politically is the Oslo Agreement. And the Oslo Agreement, and the Oslo Agreements gave the Israelis the false sense that they're about to solve the problem, and that gave the opened the door for historians and the new historians to just talk courageously about repressed issues. The main work of the new historian came after 1993. When the Second Intifada started, some of them reversed their work, such as Benny Morris, in the context of the Intifada, his famous interview in 2004, about which I'll talk later.
Well, I see the main engine of their work is actually the 1980s. And actually, I think by the late 1990s and the turn of the 20th century, there's the emergence of there was just an article in one of the journals of the Journal of Israel Studies saying that, speaking of now a post-Zionist historiography that's emerging. So I don't really see it as I don't see Oslo as fundamental. If you look, and Morris's change was a political change. He didn't renounce the portrait that he presented in his book on the Palestinian refugees, which he wrote in the 80s.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.